Hello, gentle marketers. Welcome to the Gentle Business Revolution podcast, the show where we talk about marketing your business by disrupting the current marketing paradigm and finding a better way to market your business, one that is aligned with your values. I'm Sarah Zinakrochi. I'm the host on this show. And if this is your first time here, welcome. You are listening to a raw episode, kind of an extra episode that I specifically recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic. I want you to know that this is not your regular episode. I continue to post those on Fridays where we talk about gentle marketing. But right now, I'm wanting to serve you, my community of gentle souls, with resources that help us all deal with the current situation. So this is also an episode that is not posted on my website, so I recommend you subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app so you get notified about extra episodes in the future. For today's episode, I asked my good friend Keith Carlson to join me. Keith Carlson is a registered nurse, career coach, writer, podcaster, social media influencer, motivational speaker, and award-winning nurse blogger. His podcast, The Nurse Keith Show, offers inspiration and support for nurses seeking meaning and satisfaction in their personal and professional lives. He was also co-founder and co-host of RNFM Radio, a groundbreaking and influential nursing podcast. Keith's message of dynamic empowerment reaches thousands of nurses worldwide. Keith lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In this episode that was recorded on Friday, April 17th, we talk about the current situation in the US today, how Keith offers support to nurses, and also how we all constantly go through the 5 stages of grief during this pandemic on a daily basis. A word of warning, I've been reflecting about my own frustration with some of what's going on in the world, specifically in the US. And I told Keith, who's a really good friend, so I talked very openly with him before we hit record, that I'm kind of tired of dancing around on tippy toes, not addressing the elephant in the room, the Trump administration. As you know, I'm in Europe, and it's no secret that we have our own opinion about the Trump administration. So in this episode, we express our own opinions without blaming, but just stating facts. And I could, for example, not talk about healthcare without mentioning my frustration with the fact that Trump just suspended funds to the World Health Organization. So if you are allergic to politics or are differently inclined, I recommend you skip this episode. I do feel comfortable addressing this on my podcast because it has to do with my worldview, and that's what I talk about a lot in the Gentle Marketing program. And so it would be kind of, I don't know, hypocrite almost to not address what's part of my worldview. So there you go. With that being said, here is a wonderful conversation between Keith and I. Hi, Keith. So good to see you because I see you on the video. So good to see you and hear you.
Good to see and hear you too, my friend. Thanks for having me here. It's really a privilege, and I'm just pleased to be able to speak with you and your audience.
Yeah, same here. It's been a while, and I'm so glad you double reached out to me because I did get your first email, but at the second,
Right.
I was like, yes, I want to talk to you. Talk to
Oh,
me.
I'm touched. Thank you.
So, yeah, when you reached out, I told you that I'm recording these special episodes right now for, in response to what's happening. And I thought it would be a great, topic to have you on as a specialist, as Nurse Keith, who has this community of nurses, and you're so close to what's happening right now. So why don't you? I read the bio and the intro, but why don't you talk to us a bit about your work, what you're doing on a regular
Mhm.
basis, and especially how your work has changed since this started?
Yeah. I mean, the basics of my work are the same: freelance writing, podcasting and doing holistic career coaching, mostly with nurses. So that has not changed, and some speaking as well. But everything has shifted in the context of COVID-19. So around 5, 6 weeks ago, things started to rumble, and I was starting to hear. I had my ear to the rails, so to speak, or my finger in the wind, and I could tell what was starting to happen. And I was starting to sound the bells among the people I knew, and some people were listening, some were not. And
Mm,
I noticed how people started to reach out to me through
mhm,
my different channels. And I thought, okay, this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So my coaching, I do career coaching for nurses, but it's not just resumes and cover letters and LinkedIn, though I do those things. Those are like the tools in the toolbox. A lot of what I do is emotional and psychic and spiritual support. So it's a little bit of life coaching. I don't delve into psychotherapy, but I take people to the edge. And then I say, well, maybe this is something for a counselor. So I call it holistic because I can't just help someone with a resume if I don't know what their life is like and what they love and what hurts them and what their pain is and what their families and loved ones' pains are. So now the pains have to do with the pandemic, with the threats they see out in the world in terms of their work or their lack thereof. And so my coaching has shifted because the tenor of the world is such that it has to shift, because people are coming to me with their normal issues and challenges and problems, with superimposed over that is a pandemic, the worst pandemic we've seen since 1918. So it's my coaching's become more complex, more nuanced, and I find this is a time in history. One of the opportunities here is that people are reevaluating their lives. They're saying, what's most important to me?
mhm.
And when people are dying everywhere and sick, and the threat of anything out there being a vector for disease, we really think about what's really most important. And I'm talking to nurses who are isolated in their homes, who don't have work and can't leave to go on job interviews. And, there's all sorts of different situations. So in my writing, I do a lot of freelance writing, and all of my editors have shifted me completely to COVID-19, because I write about it kind of metaphorically and inspirationally. And I do write about some of the data and stuff, but I lean more in the direction of not the poetry of the situation, but the the deeper meaning of the situation. So I use a lot of metaphor and story.
Maybe we'll get back to that and you can
Maybe
tell
we
us more
will.
about it. Um, I, I want to first, I didn't mention it in the intro, but I'm recording this podcast also to, to honor everyone who's in the front lines right now, to um, all the nurses and doctors and everybody who's working in hospitals. We mentioned when we were discussing offline, yeah, it's not just the doctors and nurses, it's everyone. It's the janitor, it's the person who cooks the food, everyone who has to
Mhm.
go out there basically. And I would even, extend that to everybody who's still working in the grocery stores or in the
Absolutely.
public transport, or
Delivering
anybody who's
mail.
yeah, the mailman. So in a way our country or our globe is in lockdown, but it's still working to some
Mhm.
extent, right? All our
That's right.
basic needs are still fulfilled, and who do we have to thank? It's all those people who are still working.
And I thank them. When I go to the store, I was at our local food cooperative yesterday, and I said to every worker I encountered or walked by, I said, thank you for working. What you're doing is just as important as a nurse in the ER. It's just different.
Yeah.
You're keeping us fed. And if this place was closed, we would have a big problem. So I thank them. And a lot of them seem surprised, and some seem like they've heard it before, but they
Hmm.
smile behind their masks. I can tell because I see their
Hmm.
eyes light up.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was listening to an interview on The Daily, which is a New York Times daily morning podcast, and it's usually just one story for about half an hour. And today's, or was it yesterday's, was an interview with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's really kind of a superstar freshman congresswoman from the Bronx, and
Hmm.
that's where my mom was born. It's a borough of New York City, and she was talking about how her constituency is probably 70% people of color, and she said most of them are those people who work in grocery stores and
Right.
all of those different things. And she said all of this thing about working from home, She said, that's a privilege.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people out there who are exposed to this pandemic who don't have an option to work at home. And
Yeah.
they would love to work at home, but they work in dry cleaners and places that make food for takeout, and they collect the trash, and they clean places, and they stock grocery shelves. So it's there's a
Yeah, that's
socioeconomic
another
piece
that's
of
another
this
one. The
pandemic. Yeah.
people who pick up the trash. Imagine we wouldn't have
Yep.
that anymore.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
yeah,
Yeah.
big
Mm-hmm.
disaster. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a bit about the situation in the U.S. because you're located in Santa Fe, and as you know, I'm in Switzerland. And I was just writing to someone who's in New York, and I said, yeah, we hear terrible things, especially about New York, but also other places in the US. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that a big part of listeners are in the US, but there's also other people in, the rest of the world. So do tell us a bit
Sure.
what's going on.
Well, there's no generalizations I can make that'll be 100% accurate. So everything I share is opinion filtered through what I read and hear directly from people on the front lines, and also through the different channels I listen to, which is not the mainstream media. It's other places where I get my evidence-based data.
Right.
And the general zeitgeist here is that the response to the pandemic has been completely bungled by the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
So some of your listeners may disagree with me, but there have been things that could have been done weeks ago, even 2 months ago, that have still not been done. And the shortage of very important equipment is devastating. And we've seen the photos, maybe you've seen the photos of, in certain hospitals, nurses wearing trash bags over their bodies. They cut a hole for their head, and they're wearing trash bags in certain places, not everywhere, not everywhere. And there are community members sewing masks and delivering them to hospitals because the hospitals, some don't have enough masks for the
Mm-hmm.
nurses and for the doctors and all the people who clean and everything. So the general zeitgeist is that, from my perspective, and this is a very progressive left-wing perspective, obviously, that things have not gone well, and
Mm-hmm.
things continue to not go well. And the misinformation and mismanagement of information, and the mismanagement of resources, and the what I see as an irresponsibility of responding in a way that could have saved many lives, and we're still losing lives because of those actions or inactions. So this is a very opinionated little diatribe I'm giving you.
Yeah.
So I get calls and emails and LinkedIn messages and Twitter direct messages from nurses all over the country. Many of them are in ethical and moral dilemmas because they want to work, they want to serve, but they feel in danger, and they're
Mm-hmm.
scared, and they don't want to bring the virus home to their families. Many times they have family members who are themselves vulnerable, or maybe the nurse, him or herself, is a vulnerable person to the virus. And we know now that fairly healthy people are getting very sick, and some are dying. And we can go into the physiology of the virus, but it's a very virulent virus, and anyone who says it's like the flu doesn't know what they're talking about. It's not like the flu in pretty much any way you can imagine. So there's some pretty intense things happening out there. And I talked to a friend who works in a major ICU in Seattle. We talk several times a week, and she's told me stories that would make your blood curdle.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's unfortunately that's also what we're hearing over here.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean Europe already was never in favor of your current administration, but I think
Thank
it's
you for
no
that.
secret that yeah, especially now that Trump just suspended funds to the World Health Organization, that yeah, it's you know obviously in a situation like this, and the US is not the only country who has reacted like that. um, People try to save themselves first, right?
Oh,
That's
yes.
probably like a human reaction. And so kind of you watch the countries, every country did that. they're like, okay, let's close borders because maybe then the virus doesn't come into our country. And one after the other, that's what countries started doing. Um, but unfortunately, the Trump administration took it to a level where it's beyond just, closing borders. It's really like war, almost like when you read about the mask war and people, like, countries stealing masks from each other. And this is not fake news, this is
Mm-mm.
reality. And just, yeah, the fact that he's pulling out funds from the most important organization out there right now.
Right.
um
It's the healthcare arm of the United Nations. It's a
yeah,
very, very important body, and
yeah,
we shouldn't pull a single dollar away from the WHO.
yeah,
And any of my colleagues would say the same thing.
yeah. So yeah, it's a scary situation, but as you and I discussed offline, somehow, and what I continue to believe, it's part of a paradigm shift.
Hmm.
It's the grasping onto the power as long as you can before that power, or the pedestal that this power person sits on, eventually crumbles. We don't know when this is going to happen, and unfortunately, yes, right now it's just not a good place to be in, because it is, it's saddening that, um, basically because of his, or the administration's way of behaving, there are lives being lost. I mean, that's really what we're
Every
talking
day.
about. Yeah.
Every day. Yeah. And there's plenty of ways to get good information from not from the mainstream media. And I can share any of those. I've shared some with you privately, and there's
Mhm.
plenty of places to hear some of the raw facts about what's really happening. And, the, you know, I don't even watch the TV or listen to the radio these days, pretty much at all. Little National Public Radio and Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Is actually a great source. It's
Well, you
very
did mention the New
independent
York
media.
Times. That's a good
New
resource.
York Times podcast, Democracy Now! Is pretty strident, very, very left wing, but excellent. And then there's plenty of others that I can share. But I wanted to, can I talk a little bit about what we spoke about offline about the grief process?
Yes, please.
So I've been writing about and speaking about and just talking to friends and family about the fact that, if we look at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief that she brought forward in the late 60s, early 70s, it was first misinterpreted as that these are linear stages, that you
Mm-hmm.
have denial, bargaining, depression, um, um, acceptance, and anger, but they're not linear. And you go through all of them anytime. You can stay in one for a long time or toggle between them all. And I go through pretty much all of them at least once in most days these days. And so what I see and feel and notice is that as individuals who are in the grief process, there's no escape from it in this pandemic. And then as communities and neighborhoods, we're in it. And then as in larger towns or municipalities, and then states or regions or provinces, and then countries, and then the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a grieving process happening from the granular individual up to humanity as a whole.
Right.
And in the United States, you've probably heard, and some of your listeners have heard, that gun stores have sold out of ammunition and guns. And that's where I feel like people get stuck and they're toggling between fear, bargaining, and denial
Mm-hmm.
and anger. Like they're just stuck there. And they're just spinning around in circles in those stages. Acceptance is not even on the table.
No.
So I tend to veer more towards some sadness, some anger. Denial happens once in a while, bargaining, but I'm tending more towards moving into the area of acceptance, but not passive acceptance. It's just accepting the reality that I see before me and then deciding what I'm going to do about it and
Mm-hmm.
how I'm going to contribute. And I hear from nurses, like I have a nurse practitioner friend who works with the poorest of the poor in rural New Mexico, and people on meth and addicted to substances, and the poorest of the poor. And she feels guilty, she feels survivor's guilt to not be back in the ER where she used to work. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, you're doing an amazing job. What a service, you know? And
Mhm.
she said, well, I should be in there slogging away with my old friends in the ER. And I keep telling people that if your contribution is walking around town and waving and smiling at people, that's your contribution. If
Mhm.
that's your capacity, that's what you do. And if your capacity is to launch a podcast and reach millions of people, do that. If you want to write letters to the editor, write letters to the editor. And if you want to just help the little old lady across the street bring her trash cans in and out and maybe fill her med box for her, that's great too. So everyone has their contribution. And I feel like if we can pull ourselves out of the grief as much as we can and think about our relative privilege and think about what we can do to contribute on the even the minuscule granular level up to the global level, then that's what makes the community actually work.
Yeah.
So that's where I keep pulling people back, like keep pulling
Mhm.
them back, like do what you can, like what's your capacity, and accept your capacity and do what's within your heart. And so that's where I'm trying to lead people in that direction.
There's two things I want to comment on. First of all, I'd like you to repeat the five stages if you could, because
Yeah, there's anger,
right.
denial, bargaining, fear, and acceptance.
Right.
Those are the five identified by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and
Mhm.
they're pretty they're pretty spot on. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of sub stages, I think, and there's been a lot of research since the early 70s, but that that paradigm is still fairly, I think it's fairly cogent right now.
Right. Yeah. The other thing that came to mind was I forgot right now. What came to mind?
I always say I have pandemic brain. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm 55 and I have pandemic brain, so I have a big excuse.
I'm not 55 yet, getting there, but yeah, it will come back. It will
Okay,
come
that's
back.
fine.
But what I think what we can move more into now, as we kind of start wrapping up, is
Sure.
the the idea also. So we're going through this grieving process as as humanity, on the individual level, but also as on the group level. There's also signs of generosity, of more empathy, of kindness. And again, we are seeing those mostly on the individual level. To me, it almost seems like if we're going to this new paradigm, if we're making this change, these changes will not come from a systemic level. They'll come from the individual level.
The
And by the
grassroots.
sheer number of individuals who contribute, that's how we get to a change. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree with that. And I think about the times that I've spent in Europe, and I love Europe. I feel when I fly to almost any country in Europe, I feel like I'm home. My family came mostly from Russia and the Ukraine and that area around 1902, 1903. So I'm more Eastern European in my genes. But when I go to Europe, I feel so at home. And one of the things that moves me in Europe is like seeing groups of people walking down the street singing, like it
Mhm.
might be a song in honor of a football team, a soccer team, or, you know, it's just, there's this sense of communalism in Europe that we don't see here that much.
Mm.
And it doesn't happen here at the scale it happens and the frequency in Europe.
Mhm.
So I think in the United States, ever since the 1950s, during the Cold War, we've had this fear of socialism. It's been so vilified. And people here don't realize that Medicare and Social Security are pretty much socialist programs.
Right.
It's the state taking care of people. And I think some Americans are realizing in the course of this pandemic that generosity and community are really important. My
Mm.
wife and I have lived in a number of intentional communities. The most recent was a co-housing community here in Santa Fe. And co-housing is a model brought from Scandinavia about 50 years ago, intentional neighborhoods. And so we're communitarians at heart. So we're always thinking about other people. And in Spanish, there's this term I love. It's called los demás, which means everyone else. And it's
Mhm.
not, for me, it's not like everyone else like dismissive. It's like everyone else, like the community, la comunidad, right? So there's this sense of solidarity, and I think that is happening in certain pockets here.
Mm.
Santa Fe is a little bit of a bubble, but I think it's happening. And my hope, where I'm headed in my mind and my heart, is that my hope is that this is a learning moment for the United States, and that it could portend a sea change in how we look at the world. If Donald Trump is reelected in November, that's going to be a tougher, it's going to be a heavier lift, and it's going to take longer. And a lot of things are going to continue to be dismantled. But if he is reelected, and I hope he's not, but if he is, the fight is going to have to become more vehement. It's going to have to become stronger, and I'll be very much involved in that fight. But the fight isn't just anger. The fight is also hope that, Jesse Jackson and Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. I mean, there's a lot of leaders out there, Mother Teresa, people who've really done good work. And I think we have a lot of models for that. And Maya Angelou, I mean, there's plenty of people out there who we can follow.
Mm.
Mary Oliver, the poet. I mean, there's plenty of people. So I think there's a golden opportunity here for a vast paradigm shift around the world. But I'm focused most on the United States because I see how splintered we are, and I don't think we're gonna fix the left wing right wing rift. I think it's permanent, but there's a knitting together that could happen, and I'm hoping that certain populations will realize how much we can accomplish together. And that's what I'm going to be working towards. And that's where my hope remains. So even though I can be a fairly cynical, curmudgeonly person and often feel like humanity's just completely lost, and maybe it would be best if we did go extinct and then the earth could reclaim itself, I also feel like there's still work to be done. And I'm damned if I'm not going to do that work. So I'm in it for the long haul, and my heart's on my sleeve, and I'm never putting it away. Basically,
Yeah.
does that answer your question in some oblique way?
No, I think it does, because what you're saying is it demonstrates you are an individual, Keith, right? And so if
I
you
think
are
so.
so convinced about this paradigm shift, then you're not the only one, and that's why it's the individuals who will eventually bring some kind of systemic change.
Yeah.
And I think what this pandemic does right now is bring all of these individual, I think of the term imaginal cells, which
I
happens in
like
the
that.
transformation of a in the cocoon, right? There's the
Mhm.
imaginal cells who see the bigger picture, who see the change, and so that's what's happening right now in the pandemic is all these people who do have a vision of a different future. Their voices are growing louder because they're like, well, we can't go on that in this way. And so eventually, and we don't know if this will be by November or it will be 4 years later, but we don't give up.
Please.
We don't give
No,
up.
we don't give up. Right. And it's very interesting you brought up imaginal cells right after you said you're not the only one. Because when you said you're not the only one, I immediately went to John Lennon's song Imagine,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
some people feel is kind of cliche, but it always hits the mark. And it's like some say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I mean, and then
yeah.
you mentioned imaginal cells, and I feel
Oh,
like
that's
that's not
beautiful. Yeah,
not a coincidence. And
yeah.
John Lennon also said, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans.
Right.
So we were all making all sorts of plans for our lives. And then COVID-19 happened. And
Yeah,
many people I know have been predicting this for decades, 25, 30 years. So the alarms have gone off, but they're mostly have been unheeded and unheard. So life has happened while we've been busy making other plans,
yeah,
right? But
yeah,
like you said, I'm not the only one. You're not the only one. And you're doing your work by putting out these podcasts. I'm doing my work. The person across the street's doing whatever they're doing. And that's the grassroots is really where it has to happen because it's not going to come from the top.
yeah.
And the top doesn't even exist anyway. It's a complete It's a complete fallacy, but it's been created, and we're in it, even though it doesn't really exist in a certain respect. And
Yeah.
because people are all equal on a certain level, but there's many powers that have been brought to bear that make it feel like we're not equal. So I look at the world through that particular lens and of equality and justice, and might sound really cliche and old fashioned and real 1960s, but that's the place where my heart lives and that's where I stay. And I get mad. I get really mad, but I still go back to compassion and empathy. Like I always circle back to it. And
Maybe that's the way we could kind of close this
yeah.
conversation is by, so if we take those 5 stages again, what if we find ourselves in anger or
Hmm.
fear? How do we bring ourselves back to, the acceptance, but then also maybe to more empathy, or yeah, a positive outlook? What do
Hmm.
you work on with your nurses?
Well, earlier I mentioned privilege,
Hmm.
and we can get into a place if we allow ourselves to feel shame, like my friend who feels shame for not being in the ER, even though she's helping the poorest of the poor with their most incredible health problems, right?
Right.
She's making enormous difference in people's lives right at this minute as we're recording. So we can choose to fall into shame and stay there. And Brene Brown, Brene, Brene Brown has some great stuff out there on shame.
Mm.
And shame does not do us much good at all. So I do get into anger. I do get into sadness. And I'm very public about the fact that I've lived with depression and PTSD most of my life. So I'm very out there with that. I'm not ashamed to say it. And I go to therapy, I take antidepressants, and I talk about that publicly. So, and I feel like that normalizes it, that mental health issues and challenges and emotional and psychic and spiritual challenges are normal. And the more we talk about it, the more it becomes like people accept that, yeah, it's part of life. So when you get stuck in sadness, or what, let me say, when I get stuck in sadness, and maybe I have a little pity party and I'm feeling really bad for myself, I allow myself to go there for a little while, maybe half an hour, and then I'm like, okay, so I'm not going to shame myself for feeling bad, even though there's people dying all over the world, even though a family I support directly in Jamaica, live in a little shack and I'm helping them build 2 more rooms and a pit toilet before hurricane season. They're
Mhm.
pouring this foundation this week, actually,
Mm.
and I'm supporting that financially. It's like I can't go into shame because they're there and I'm here. I'm here and there's nothing I can do about that.
Mhm.
So, yes, 4 Jamaican families would happily live in my home, but they're not here. So, I have to process my shame, move through my shame to the place of action and the place of empathy and compassion, and have empathy and compassion for myself and say, okay, you're sad, you're angry, you feel guilty, you feel shame. Okay, so don't shame yourself for having shame or anger or
Mhm.
sadness, but now let's see what we can do. Let's snap into action. And that's not to distract myself from my sadness, because I let myself feel it. And I think, especially in the United States, I think a lot of people, there's this old, like I live in the West now. I live in the Southwest. I grew up in the East Coast, but now I live in the Southwest in New Mexico, which for some of your European listeners is bordered by Colorado to the north, Texas to the east, Arizona to the west, and Mexico to the south. So it's this like wild west thing of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, dust yourself off, and rugged individualism. And that rugged individualism is what has led us down some not such great paths in the United States.
Mm.
So I always go back to that Spanish term, los demás, like what can I do for los demás, for the rest of the world? And
Mm.
then I go out there and I do it.
Mm.
And whether it's thanking the cashier at the food co-op, or waving to the mail carrier, or giving a thumbs up to the FedEx driver, or just waving to a little girl playing in the park with her dog, right? So I do my thing. And when I have feelings, I feel them, but I try not to get stuck, because when we get stuck, we can't move. And when we can't move, we're not able to do anything or be effective. So that's what I do. And that's what I try to lead my clients through, is that process of keeping the energy moving. Not to sound too new agey, but you just have to keep things moving, just like you keep your digestive system moving by eating fiber and good food. You keep your kidneys working by drinking and hydrating. And that drinking and hydrating is actually really good. And can I talk about one physiological thing?
Yeah, please.
So there's a stress hormone called cortisol. And when we're under stress and experiencing what we call fight, flight, or freeze, it used to be called fight or flight, but now it's fight, flight, or freeze. Cortisol is released from our adrenal glands, I believe, I think. Any doctors or nurses or anyone out there can correct me. But it's released into our bloodstream. And that cortisol has all sorts of effects. It makes us tense. It makes our pupils enlarge, makes us ready for the saber-toothed tiger coming around the corner. We have to flush the cortisol. The best way to flush cortisol is exercise, respiration, and sweating, and also flushing with fluids and urinating, because you can pass that cortisol through your urinary system. And then other ways of increasing your dopamine and the positive chemicals is laughter, exercise, jumping up and down, physical movement, smiling even has an effect and releases happy chemicals. So this isn't a Pollyannish solution, but you can shift your energy in many, many, many ways. And if you're feeling that level of stress, you have to flush the cortisol and other stress hormones out of your body. And one of the best ways is to move and get out there and move. And you will generally feel better. So I do those things for myself, actually, and I lead my clients in doing those things. And that can be so helpful. And if you don't move those stress hormones and you stay tense, then that's where you get stuck in sadness or depression
Right.
and anger. And it's not a healthy place to live.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the examples you gave. So one would be just find your next step, right? Like
Hmm.
even if it's just like helping, what they saw in research over and over again is helping someone else
Hmm.
makes you actually almost feel better than the person that has received your help.
That's
It's
very
wonderful.
true. So
So
true.
in these special times right now, there's so many small acts that where you can really be helpful, and be it with your neighbors or with your elderly parents, whatever it is. Some I heard on another podcast that in a town in England, someone put up posters saying that, basically like the extended hand. I don't know if in the U.S. it exists, but here there's a public number that you can call. It's called the
Mm.
extended hand, and you can
Oh, nice.
call them when you have depression or suicidal thoughts. Or so this
Yeah.
person just thought, I'll be that number, and he gave out the number to the whole town. So I thought
That's
that was
lovely.
beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have the National Suicide Hotline and other hotlines, and there's
Okay.
special ones for veterans. And yeah,
Right.
so it's out there. It's
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. But those are probably right now pretty overloaded.
I
So
bet.
if, you have the capacity to, talk to your neighbors, or just be, someone, not really talk, but listen, because right now it's more about listening than talking.
That's
And
very true.
yeah.
Very, very true.
And so
Yeah.
yeah, the drinking and the laughing, especially. I was just on my Italian lesson earlier today, and we talked about embarrassments. So that was very funny.
Oh,
We
funny.
had to each share a story that was very embarrassing. So yeah, just laughing with each other, that really helps in terms of lifting your mood, for
Absolutely. I mean, a week ago, I was with a friend who, we were socially distant and practicing our, not, being safe, but we watched Monty Python videos, and
yeah,
we just laughed because you just
yeah,
needed to laugh. And I do
exactly.
that myself sometimes. And, it's really helpful. And
Yeah.
it's a simple, simple thing, but it has profound physiological effects.
So true.
Yeah.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Keith, for showing up here and sharing with our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You stay well and safe, and your loved ones and everyone listening, your loved ones, your friends, your families, your communities, please be safe. Look for the good information out there and focus on community and health and love and compassion and empathy, and that will go a long way. So, Sarah, thanks for being a voice of positivity out there, and you're just one of the most wonderful human beings I know.
Thank you, Keith. Please do also share your podcast because, I'm not sure there's any nurses in the audience, but they might have relatives who are nurses that
Sure.
would want to listen to your show.
Yeah, it's the Nurse Keith Show. And my COVID-19 podcasts are actually pretty universal. And they're not, some of them are factual, but I had one recently on the power of play and how play
Mhm.
can help you heal, speaking of stress. And I have one coming out on resilience. I have one coming out on the powers of empathy and compassion. And then I also have like regular kind of more like science-y, nursey, medical COVID updates. But there's plenty of stuff on my show that's universal. So, and there's a lot of positivity. So anyone is
Okay.
free to listen anytime.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming, Keith.
Thanks, Sarah.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation and found value in it. And if you do share my worldview, I'd love to hang out with you in the Gentle Business Circle. It is a safe zone to hang out with other imaginal selves and help each other build our business and grow our impact. When you join the circle, which starts in May, you get one live monthly circle Q&A call with me and fellow gentle marketers. These calls will be recorded and you can really ask anything. You also get access to my new mini course, Authentic and Fair Pricing, and some secret bonus episodes that I record and only share with the Gentle Business Circle members every now and then. The calls take place once per month, every second Wednesday of the month, and there are different levels of support starting out at $7 per month. You can find out more at sarahsanacroce.com/circle. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Let's be the change we want to see in the world. Take care of yourself.